Hello there, Mentioners. If you haven't subscribed to our premium podcast, Beyond Mentioning, here's what you missed this week. Hello, Mentioners, and welcome to Beyond Mentioning, your weekly Patreon podcast for The Mentionables. This week, we present another episode of our new series called Devil's Advocate. In this episode, we will hear a showdown between Mentionables Joel Furches and Clinton Wilcox. As you know, Clinton is our resident pro-life specialist, and on this episode, he will defend the pro-life position against Joel, who will play the Devil's Advocate, and question Clinton about the pro-life position. How will Clinton stand up to the debate? Let's listen and find out.
Devil's Advocate! So the concept behind Devil's Advocate is that we're going to bring a mentionable on, and then I'll grill them and take the position of the skeptic for the purposes of grilling them on their signature argument. So for listeners, everybody should be familiar with Clinton. Our regular listeners, he's a regular company podcast, and for our premium listeners, we've had two of his debates featured on the podcast. So we all know Clinton, we all know what he's about, and tonight we're going to be grilling him on the pro-life position. And up there in the corner, you'll see Caleb. You might know about him. I don't know. All right. So, Clinton, how you doing this evening?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you doing?
Good. Quarantine treating you okay?
Yeah, pretty good. I've been getting in some. Well, I've still been working. I play for the service at my church in the mornings. We live stream our services, so we don't have the congregation meeting, but I still have responsibilities as a musician to play. And I also still do my responsibilities with LTI, the writing for the blog, doing the podcast, answering questions that are submitted through the website, things like that, as well as other writing things. And I've been getting some game time in too. A friend actually told me about an RPG on the Xbox One that I hadn't heard about before, so I purchased it and I'm giving it a try. So, keeping busy, trying to work, but trying to, not to go too crazy and, getting some game time into.
Sounds exhausting.
A little bit, yeah. Yeah, it's just partially of what I'm doing. I've got some other projects going on too.
So, Clinton, you work for LTI. Why don't you tell us about that? What's that like, working for them, and what do they do?
Well, sure. LTI stands for Life Training Institute, and it's a pro-life educational organization. They usually go into high schools to do assemblies and talk to classrooms about the pro-life position, usually Christian ones, but if they can get into a non-religious school, they'll do those too. I'm not an official speaker for LTI. There are official speakers. I do some speaking. but I'm not one of the official speakers for the organization. My official responsibilities for LTI are more of the online things. Like if there's a question submitted through the website, I'll answer those questions. I write articles for the blog. I do the podcast with my co-host Nathan, who used to be with LTI, but now he's with Jay Watts' organization called, I believe they're called Equally Human Ministries, something like that. Those are primarily my official responsibilities with LTI, but I do some speaking as well.
So Nathan got sniped by a competitor, huh?
Oh, well, not exactly. It's a kind of a long story, but
yeah, you don't have to get into that.
Right.
We've only got an hour to knock this out anyway.
Right.
All right, so tonight we're going to be grilling you in the pro-life position, and I'll be taking the position of the skeptic, interviewer, as it were. So for the purposes of having the maximum amount of time, why don't you go ahead and lay out sort of the simplified version of the pro-life position?
Well, sure. The pro-life argument can basically be reduced to a syllogism. To anyone who's been in a logic class, they'll recognize what a syllogism is. For those who aren't, essentially a syllogism is just an argument of two premises that lead to a conclusion. And in a deductive syllogism, if your premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. If your premises are true, your conclusion cannot be false. So the basic pro-life syllogism, and there are a number of arguments I could give for the pro-life position, but this is kind of the most basic one. Premise one is, it is immoral, it is wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Premise two is abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Then the conclusion necessarily follows that abortion is immoral or abortion is wrong. And so the basic way that we can support these premises is that premise number one is it is immoral to intentionally kill an innocent human being. And this is something that we just all know. Nobody supports the killing of a human being. So intuitively, we all understand it's wrong to kill an innocent human being. You could offer some other arguments too that don't necessarily rely on intuition. One of those arguments would be the argument from rights. All human beings have certain inalienable rights, such as the right to life, and with rights come duties. And so if I have a right, I must be the kind of thing that can recognize and abide by duties. So if I, as a human being, have a right to life, that means that I have a duty, or in other words, an obligation to respect the right to life of others. And these rights are not just something that society grants. If rights were just granted by society, well, then society would basically have the authority to take the rights away whenever it wanted to. But of course, society doesn't grant rights. So our rights inhere in us by nature. And this is the only way to make sense of certain propositions, such as that slavery is wrong. If society grants rights, and that means that slavery would be morally permissible in societies that have legal slavery, because they have decided that slavery should be legal. The only way to make sense of the proposition that slavery is wrong and we should change a nation that engages in slavery is if our rights inhere in us by nature and are not granted by the government. So our rights inhere in us by nature. And since the unborn have a human nature, when they are conceived, when the sperm meets the egg, a new human organism comes into existence, and there's a biological continuity from fertilization until it becomes an adult. And so since it's the same thing through all points in its life, it never changes from one thing to something else. So it is always a human organism. So that means that if our rights inhere in us by nature, and the unborn organism has a human nature and is the same organism from fertilization until it becomes an adult, that means that it has the right to life and all of the rights ascribed to human beings from fertilization until it becomes an adult, until it dies naturally. So that's a basic defense of the first premise, that it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Now, premise two is abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. And this is attested to by science. Scientists discovered in the mid-1800s that human life begins at fertilization. And this is not something that's been questioned in scientific fields. It's been accepted by all embryologists since that time. And it's not something that's even denied by pro-choice philosophers. Philosophers like Michael Tooley, David Boonin, Peter Singer, all of these people believe that abortion is permissible, but they agree with the science that human life begins at fertilization. And since it's basically as sure as anything can be regarding science, it's not disagreed upon by any of the experts in those fields. So biologically, it's a human being from fertilization. And so if it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being, and of course the word innocent doesn't mean that it's capable of doing any moral wrong, because obviously embryos and fetuses, just like infants and toddlers, are too young to be able to recognize right from wrong. So it's not innocent in a moral sense. It's innocent more in a legal sense, in that it hasn't done anything to warrant being put to death. Like we might say, if you commit a murder, well, that brings with it the punishment of death, that a court can rule against a murderer, and then the executioner, of course, can carry that out. Now, of course, capital punishment is a controversial idea, so I'm not necessarily saying that it's completely true. I'm just showing that in this case, when we say an innocent human being, we're speaking of more in a legal sense, that it hasn't done anything to warrant death. So abortion does intentionally kill an innocent human being. And so if it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being, and if abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being, then logically it follows necessarily that abortion is immoral. And that's the basic pro-life argument. Okay.
Sounds very basic. All right.
Well, yeah, I mean, it can get, trust me, it can get a lot more complex. And it probably will, if depending on where you decide to take the criticisms.
So pro-life is at bottom a religious argument.
No, I didn't make any sort of religious argument. My arguments were based entirely in science and philosophy.
Well, you sort of did. First of all, because you said we have inherent rights. Now, how can you ground inherent rights without reference to religion or God?
Well, if you think back to my arguments were, number one, rights are not granted by society. If they are, then we can't make sense of certain arguments like slavery is wrong. Because if a society grants that slavery should be legal, then we can't say that slavery is wrong unless our rights inhere in us by nature. Because if our rights don't inhere in us by nature, then there's nothing that grounds the wrongness of enslaving someone, especially if society has legalized slavery. So we know so rights can't be granted by government. Otherwise, the government has the authority to take those rights away, and that just isn't true.
All right. So where are they granted then?
And there are other ways we can argue against that too. For example, if rights are granted by society, then there's no such thing as a moral reformer. Someone like Martin Luther King Jr. was doing something immoral by trying to change society because he was going against the morality of the time. So I'm sorry, what was your question?
I said you can't ground them in society. How do you ground these rights?
You can ground them. You can ground them through God. That's one way you could go, and I think that's a good way to go, because if you're an atheist, you can't just necessarily assume atheism is true in order to get around the fact that our rights are God-given if God does exist. But aside from arguing the religious route, you can actually go the non-religious route too. And you have to have a discussion of what exactly are rights. Well, rights, properly understood, rights are generally a metaphysical thing which grounds my obligation toward other people. So if I say, for example, that human beings have a right to life, well, that doesn't mean that I necessarily think that there's something inside a human being that I can point to and say, there, that's your right to life. What that essentially means is that I have an obligation to treat another human in a certain way. So if all human beings have rights, like a right to life, I have an obligation to treat all other human beings in a way that doesn't unjustly take their life. So a right is just essentially a metaphysical ground of how I have an obligation to treat other people. So then the question becomes, well, how should I treat other people? And for this, I think natural law actually provides the best grounding for rights. And it's actually our forefathers here in the United States in the Declaration of Independence ground our inalienable rights in natural law. And so natural law says, well, there are certain ways that there are certain things things that are good for an individual, and there are certain things that are bad for an individual. For example, Edward Feser, who's a philosopher, would say, well, think of a squirrel. What's good for a squirrel? Well, squirrels, gather nuts for the winter, during warmer times so that they have them for the winter. They have to drink water and things like that. But what if there's a squirrel that actually likes to lay out in the middle of the freeway and consume nothing but toothpaste? Well, we would say that that's bad for that squirrel because he might get run over, or he's, going to have some things wrong with him if all he's doing is just consuming toothpaste. So we would say that's bad for a squirrel, but gathering nuts from the winter is good for a squirrel. Now, squirrels are not moral agents because they cannot recognize the moral law. They can't recognize right from wrong, but human beings can. So if there is a certain thing that's good for a human being, we say that whatever is good for a human is something that will promote that human's flourishing. And something that's bad for a human is something that frustrates that human's flourishing. So when we say that we have rights, all that essentially means is I know what's good to promote human flourishing and I know what's bad. And so things that promote human flourishing are things that I need to survive, like things like water, things like food. One can make an argument that even something like sex is a right because that's how human beings procreate. And so all of these things are necessary for survival. So if I can tell what things are necessary for a human being's survival, then I can say, then essentially I know what's good for Bob's and for Phil's and for, Stacy's flourishing and all these other people. And so if I have rights and I want my rights to be respected, then I am obligated to respect the rights that Bob and Stacy has. And since Bob and Stacy are similar things to me, that is human beings with a rational nature, then the things that are good for them are the things that are good for me. And so that's basically how I would, I guess maybe that doesn't quite sound so basic because it requires a little bit of an explanation. But I think that natural law is probably the best way to ground rights from a non-religious perspective.
Okay, so you just...
by the way, did that explanation make sense?
To a degree.
Okay, because I just want to make sure I'm explaining it clearly, because if not, that might have been my fault for not being as clear as I could have been.
We'll tease it out.
Okay.
But okay, so you...
Oh, so you're really taking this devil's advocate thing seriously.
Let's continue.
Right.
Let's refer to your squirrel scenario. Okay, so you have the squirrel who wants to lie out in the middle of the freeway and consume toothpaste. Now, that might not be good for the flourishing of that squirrel, but it's what the squirrel wants to do. What makes the desire of the squirrel less important than the physical well-being of the squirrel?
Well, for the squirrel, maybe it's not more important because, the squirrel isn't a moral agent. Okay. But we are. And so, I wouldn't necessarily, if a squirrel wants to go out and lay out in freeways and consume toothpaste, I wouldn't really go out of my way to stop that because it's a squirrel.
Let's cut past the squirrel.
No. I know. I'm going to explain, because if I saw, a human toddler out laying in the street, I'm going to go out there and bring him back in away from the street, because I think human beings have a certain value that squirrels don't have. But now, so I wouldn't necessarily care what the squirrel wants. If he wants to do what's bad for him, then it's a squirrel. I say let it. But if we look at what's good or bad for a squirrel qua squirrelness, in other words, for the squirrel as a squirrel, that's bad for the squirrel because it frustrates that squirrel's ability to flourish as a squirrel. And so that's essentially what makes it good or bad. Does it promote the squirrel's flourishing, or does it frustrate the squirrel's flourishing? If it promotes the squirrel's flourishing, then it's good for the squirrel. If it frustrates the squirrel's flourishing, then it's bad for the squirrel. But it's a squirrel, so I'm not going to be too concerned about whether or not, the squirrel wants to do what's good for it.
Okay, but obviously we're using the squirrel as an allegory for human beings, so let's jump straight to the human being. I'm a fully realized human adult.
Right? Yeah, I'm not analogizing the squirrel with humans. I'm comparing and contrasting what's good for an individual, because what's good for a human isn't necessarily what's good for a squirrel, and vice versa.
Right. So I'm a fully realized human adult, correct? And let's say that I desire to go sit on a tanning bed 24 hours a day. That's a right I have. something it's a service I can pay for, and it puts me at high risk for cancer. Same thing would be true if I was a 3-pack a day smoker. I can go out, I can pay the money that I earned. I have the right in society to do this, and I have the right to take that risk, which ultimately would be death. This is not great for my flourishing, but it's a right that I have. So how could you, at what point, where's the line drawn where I can't do this thing because it's not great for my individual flourishing?
Yeah, so we have to make a distinction between a legal right and a moral right.
Okay.
Legal rights are rights that are and can be granted by the government. For example, the right to vote is a legal right, and these rights usually come about through maturity. I can't vote when I'm 5 because I'm not old enough to understand the issues or to know who's running or anything like that. So the right to vote is a right that's granted by the government, and the government is not under an obligation to basically give everyone the same right. Because, for example, an Italian citizen doesn't have the right to vote in an American election because they're not an American citizen. So we have to make a distinction between a legal right and a moral right. And so not everything that is immoral is illegal. For example, adultery is something we can think of that is immoral, but it's legal. If you want to cheat on your wife, the law is not going to stop you from doing so. Now, the law can hold you accountable because you make your vows, and in some cases they do prenuptial agreements, but you're breaking a contract, so there are repercussions. But if you commit adultery, the law is not going to prevent you or hold you accountable in any way for doing that. So when we might say that what you're doing is immoral from a moral perspective, you're doing something that's immoral. So you don't have the moral right to do it, but you have the legal right to do it because the law is not going to prevent you from doing it. So we have to make this distinction between a moral right and a legal right.
Okay. So you just made a distinction between a moral right and a legal right, but you're arguing with the abortion policy that your morality so be legality. What allows you to cross that line between morality and legal rights?
Right, and that's a fair question because obviously, like I just said, something like cheating on your wife, committing adultery is immoral, but is not illegal. So that's a fair question. But the way that I would respond to that is by saying that the killing of an innocent human being is the kind of act that we consider or that we make illegal. It's not just immoral, but murder is illegal. And so, if the pro-life position is correct that the unborn are innocent human beings and abortion kills an innocent human being, then they're actually committing an act of murder. Now, it's not legally recognized as murder right now, but pro-life people are arguing that it should be recognized as an act of murder. And so that's why we feel that that we should make these things illegal and solidify that in law, because if the pro-life argument is true, then abortion is an act of murder and should be considered an act of murder.
Okay, so you made 2 arguments as far as that goes. The first was that, intuitively it's wrong to murder somebody, right? Mm-hmm. And the other is that we have certain rights granted to us that are, innate to our character.
Well, to our nature, yeah.
To our nature, fair enough. All right, so human beings, as a species, have certain rights under human society, right?
Yes, yeah. We have rights, under a human society.
Okay, fair enough. Rights that we wouldn't necessarily have if we were squirrels living in a human society.
Right, yeah, because we don't grant rights to squirrels, and we don't recognize that squirrels have any rights. So, yeah.
And if we were ourselves placed in a society that was a non-human society, then we wouldn't necessarily have rights in that society because we're not the same species and we don't have the same one another.
It depends on what kind of society you're talking about. Could you kind of parse that out a little bit?
Okay, so fair enough. I'm trying to see if this is a species thing. I am a human being. I am of the same nature as you. Therefore, I owe you the same rights that I myself have as a human being. But if I were, say, in a Klingon society, would that still apply? Now, I'm assuming you would argue that both Klingons and humans are moral agents, and therefore it has less to do with species and more to do with agency.
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say it has to do with agency per se, because obviously we still grant rights to members of humanity which aren't able to recognize morality. Infants and toddlers, for example, still have rights. And that's not because they're not rational. They're not members of a rational species. They're human beings, but it's because they're too young to be able to recognize right from wrong. And that's why it's the parent's responsibility to instill that in her children. So my argument then is not necessarily that we have rights because we're human. It's because we have a rational nature. All human beings, since they all have a human nature, and it's in the nature of human beings to be rational. All human beings have a rational nature. So if we encounter intelligent aliens like Klingons or Vulcans or Romulans, I'm a huge Trekkie myself. I could go on all day.
I knew it.
Yeah. So if we found ourselves in that kind of a society, well, they should recognize our rights as rational agents. If they don't, then then they're basically doing something immoral. Like if you go to Kronos, which is the Klingon homeworld to the uninitiated, and they immediately enslave you, well, they've just violated your natural right to freedom. And now again, there are certain legal rights which are reasonable for Klingons to grant. Like I should not be able to go and vote on the Chancellor of the Klingon High Council. But because that's basically a responsibility of Klingons. It's not something that I as a human would have any right to go and to try and influence. But there are certain natural rights which all societies are obligated to respect, such as my right to life, my right to freedom, etc. So
Okay.
so essentially, just to kind of nutshell that, it's about our nature, not necessarily about our species. But saying that we are human is not just a biological category; it's also to say that we have a rational nature, and so it's the nature then that grounds our rights, not necessarily our biological humanity.
Okay, so you just, I had made the argument of agency, or I'd introduced that, and you said something to the effect that, not everyone has agency, such as the very young. I believe somebody who's in a vegetative state, or somebody who's hydrocephalic, born with a sack of water instead of a brain, things like that. So, and then you turned it around to rational agency instead of moral agency. And yet, at a certain stage in development, there's not a lot of rational agency in a human being. Or if they're born with a water sac instead of a brain, they don't have any rationality. So it appears that there's a spectrum along which human beings can lie based on their faculties, which would place them as rational versus outside the boundaries of rationality. They don't have a rational. Yeah, go ahead.
I wouldn't necessarily say that there's a spectrum per se. All human beings, by virtue of being human, have a rational nature. Now, this goes for the very young, because we know that let's for example, an infant who is perfectly healthy is on a natural course of development into becoming something that is presently rational. And the only reason that it can become something that is presently rational on its own is because it has a disposition toward being rational. And this disposition is grounded in its nature. So the reason that it's able to become that on its own is because it has the nature of a rational being. And this is true of embryos and fetuses too. They're not presently rational, of course, because they can't engage in rational thought, but they have the disposition toward rationality because they have a rational nature. And it's that rational nature that grounds all of their capacities. And so, of course, they just have to go through human development. They have to be able to develop their human parts. They have to develop their brain. They have to develop enough neurons to be able to use the brain properly. All of this stuff, and all that is just because they're too young, and they have to undergo a course of development in order to be able to get to the point where they can become presently rational. Now, of course, that naturally leads to the question that you asked. What about someone who's, for example, anencephalic, someone who is born with the brain outside their body and isn't able to develop naturally and will never reach the point where they're rational? And we don't even have to look at someone with that kind of deformity, someone who won't survive long after birth, but we can just look at severely mentally handicapped people who never reach the point of rationality and just throughout their lives are not able to engage rationally. Well, the way that we would respond to this is because they are human, they still have that rational nature. But if someone is not able to become rational, well, we recognize that as a tragedy. We wouldn't say it's a tragedy if a hedgehog fails to develop rationality, Sonic the Hedgehog notwithstanding, of course. We would say it's a tragedy. It's not a tragedy if they fail to become rational, because it's not in the nature of hedgehogs to be rational. It is in the nature of humans to be rational. So a human who is not rational, we recognize that as a tragedy, and we recognize that that human being is not able to flourish as humans are. And so that's tragic, because they're not able to fulfill that flourishing. Now, the reason we can say that they still have a rational nature, and not that they're lacking a rational nature just because they're not able to fulfill that, is because as human beings, they have certain capacities which are latent within them, capacities that they have to be able to develop certain things in order to utilize. And so we don't even have to necessarily look at someone who is not rational. We can look at someone who's blind. Human beings are the kinds of beings that should see. And so someone who loses his sight has basically lost the present capacity for sight, but they still have that capacity within them at a latent level. And we can even see this because some people can actually regain lost eyesight, like if you transplant their corneas. So human beings still have the latent or inherent capacity for sight, even if they don't have the ability to presently exercise that function. And it's the same thing for the severely handicapped. They still have a rational nature. They're just unable to exercise that rationality because of disease or injury or genetic deformity or whatever the reason happens to be. So they're still members of a rational species. They're just unable to exercise their rationality. And there could come a point one of these days when we understand the brain well enough that we're able to help someone who can't be rational be able to exercise, at least to some degree, that rationality, just like in some cases we can help someone restore lost eyesight. But in both cases, they still have that rational nature. They're still a member of a rational species, a rational kind of species. And so they're still human beings, still deserving of human dignity and respect, and they still have rights which we're obligated to respect.
Okay, so what I hear you arguing here is that there's sort of this ideal human being which has all of the faculty a human being would ordinarily have to its, acceptable degree, let's say. Not necessarily even maximum degree, but they have eyes that see, they have a nose that smells, they have a functioning brain that all neural centers are more or less functioning at capacity, and so forth. So you have this ideal, right? And because this ideal exists, then every human is treated as if they met this ideal.
Sort of. I suppose you can kind of look at it that way, because we still, so we still, it's not exactly that we treat them as if they met these, because obviously, we're not going to shove a math book in front of a severely mentally handicapped person because they don't have that capacity. So we're not exactly treating them in all respects as if they have that rationality. But because they have that rational nature, the nature is what makes someone a person. It's what grounds your rights. So it's not that we're treating you as if you were rational. It's that we're respecting the fact that you have a rational nature, because that is ultimately what makes you a valuable individual. Someone with rights is your underlying nature. So we're not treating someone without rationality as if they were rational. We're just respecting the fact that they still have that rational nature and still deserve a level of respect and dignity, simply because they're essentially, one of us, essentially.
So a lot of your arguments appear to be more than they are grounded in reality. So, for instance, you said that it's wrong to murder, but then you appealed to intuition as your grounding for that. And then as far as this goes, you say that they have a nature. Now, that's a sort of abstract term, and their nature isn't fully realized if they, were born with their brain outside their body, or if they're born without eyes or anything like that. Could say that, if you dig into the human genome and map it out, eyes are a thing that a person should have, or brain is a thing that a person should have, according to the average human genome. But now you're abstracting that concept to a sort of a nature type thing. Now, what justifies these abstractions and intuitions that you appeal to?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you mean that I'm abstracting these kinds of things, but I think it can be shown that there are such things as natures. For example, what's the difference between a square and a triangle? Well, a square has 4 sides and a triangle has 3 sides. So if I show you a square and I say this is a triangle, you can tell whether or not I'm telling the truth or whether or not I'm getting it right, because I might just be mistaken. And so the only way we can tell the difference between a square and a triangle is if there is something by which it, let me see how to put this. We can tell a square is a square because there is something by which it means this is a square. There's something that it is like to be a square, essentially. And so what is it like to be a square? Well, you have to have 4 equal sides. If you have 4 sides, but 2 are equal to each other and 2 are equal to each other, but they're different, well, then you have a rectangle, not a square. And so the only way to tell these different kinds of polygons is if there is a nature, if there is something we can say that it is like to be this certain thing. So if I hold up a picture of a triangle, we know that it's not a square. It's not an octagon. It's a triangle because it has 3 sides, and it's in the nature of triangles to have 3 sides. If I add a side to that triangle, well, it ceases to be a triangle, and now it's a square because now it has 4 sides, whereas triangles have 3. So the only way to make sense of the fact that there's a difference between certain things is if there's natures. If there's no such thing as a nature, well, then we couldn't say that there is anything that it's like to be a triangle. If there's no such thing as an objective nature that we can appeal to, well then.
Like what you heard? Well, head on over to patreon.com/mentionables and subscribe for this and much more premium content.